Hello. Now I kind of wish I had gone for the side mic, but it seemed Backstreet Boys-ish at the time, so I didn't do it. Okay, before I get going, I want to do a poll because I realized when I was writing this talk on the plane, I was imagining an American audience, which was probably naive, and I don't know that much about podcasting in Romania. So maybe I can get a show of hands. How many people in this room have listened to a podcast? Yeah. Okay. How many people in this room have appeared as a guest on a podcast or made their own podcast? Okay, a few less. So I will feel like I have done my job here if I inspire even one of the people who had their hands down to give this a try. And that's really what I want to talk about. My experiences starting podcasts. So my name is Lammer. I do a lot of things, but I think if someone asked me on an airplane, I would say that I'm a podcast host. And it's a strange thing to tell people that you're a podcast host. It's not a very well-known profession at this point. It's like saying you're a birthday party clown. It doesn't have the gravitas of journalism. It doesn't have the technical wizardry of saying you're an audio engineer. People just kind of smile and don't ask questions usually. So as the introduction said, I started Longform.org with Max Linsky, who will be speaking next in 2010. And at the time Longform was coming into being, it was just as the iPhone and smartphones were starting to become widespread, and people started to think, what am I going to read on this phone? People were bringing them on their commutes. People were, I can still sort of remember that first time I got on the train and I realized that every single person was staring at their phone. And for me in my own work life, those kinds of changes feel like a opportunity to me. But I think in order to take advantage of those changes, you have to think as much as a product designer as a storyteller, because you are trying to interact with these brief moments in other people's lives. So I rode the train to the airplane when I was coming here, and there was a different new phenomenon, which was pretty much everyone in my train had on AirPods. I don't know how popular the AirPods are here at this point, but just buy Apple stock, trust me. You really can walk all over New York City and barely find a person that you could have a conversation with because the AirPods are so ubiquitous. And as someone who talks to people through those AirPods, that's an exciting opportunity for me. And this talk is going to be about how I became a voice in other people's head and what I've learned about that. But we're actually getting way ahead of ourselves here because we need to go back to 2010, which is about 900 years on the internet. At that point, I had never heard a podcast. This may be the first time I'm admitting this. I had downloaded a BitTorrent file that had every single This American Life episode on it, and then I loaded it onto an iPod, and I would bring it to the gym and work out. Somehow I managed to listen to over 300 episodes of This American Life without losing any weight. But I don't really think that's a podcast, because when people say, oh, there's too many podcasts now, I don't think they're saying like too many people are BitTorrenting shows and loading them onto iPods. I think really podcasting, as I know it, came into play at the same time as smartphones became ubiquitous. I think a lot of people don't really know. I've totally failed to advance these slides. The next frontier is sound. Wait, what's a podcast? Okay, here we are. A podcast is a protocol. Probably the best known protocol is email. I assume everyone in this room uses email. But who owns email? Email is basically a set of rules for me to send something, for someone else to receive it, that anyone could be the intermediary. It can be Gmail, or you could set up your own server or whatever. And podcasts actually operate pretty similarly. They use RSS, which is a technology that was originally built to distribute blog posts. But instead of an HTML file where you would expect to find a link to an article, you instead find an MP3 file. That is all podcasting is. That's the entire explanation. So all of these companies like Apple and Google and Spotify, where you can subscribe to podcasts now, all they're doing is indexing a bunch of those RSS files and putting them in a convenient package. And it's my belief that protocols usually outlast companies. Email has outlasted most of the companies that originally engaged in email hosting, and I believe that podcasting will follow a similar course. And it's one of the reasons it's exciting to me as a format is that it is independent of all of these giant tech companies. They participate in it, but they can't truly control it because it's an open protocol. Okay, this is the biggest question about podcasting. Is this a good time to start a podcast? So I started my first podcast in 2012. And here are the two reactions I would get from people when I said I was starting a podcast. They would either say, "What is a podcast? No one listens to that. I don't know why you're doing that." Or, "Aren't there too many podcasts? It's kind of a bubble and a fad. I think you're too late. It's going to be really hard to build an audience now." So these are conflicting impulses that people have, that either podcasting is irrelevant or it's so relevant that there's no space for anyone else and you shouldn't come to the party. When people are that confused about what's going on, I generally think there's an opportunity. I don't know, if anyone is saying there's too many podcasts in Romania right now, but they eventually will. And my belief is that whenever right now is the right time to start a podcast. That same image that I failed to make a slide about, which would have shown everyone with AirPods in, that is an opportunity. Every minute of every commute, of every gym session, these are new ear minutes that are being opened up to people who want to make things that are interesting to people. The other thing about that is the best podcasts take years to evolve. So even if you don't feel like this is the exact moment for your podcast, there's no reason to it doesn't cost anything. Just go for it. So you've now agreed to make a podcast. What should the podcast be about? You would think that when we were starting the Longform podcast, because we already had a fairly successful website, it would be easy to figure out what to do in a podcast format. We just translate the website to a podcast. It turns out you can't really do that. I'll tell you about the sort of thought process we went. So as the introduction said, Longform curates great nonfiction from around the web. So our first idea was that we would do a roundup show where we would talk about all of the articles that came out that week and say which ones were good and which ones sucked. That ultimately got nixed because myself and my co-hosts are all cowards, and a lot of those writers live in New York and no one wanted to trash people publicly. Then we thought maybe we would have writers come on the show and read their stories aloud. In retrospect, that's a book on tape, not a podcast. It took us a long time to gravitate to what I think now is actually a pretty straightforward idea, which is to interview writers about how they do their job and how they got there. That is not a particularly sexy pitch. It's not like people are like, "Wow, I can't wait to hear that." But the advantage you get in a setup like that is that we're building on all these incredible, smart people. It's not really about us. It's about the guests. And those guests are out traveling the world, reporting, doing journalism, but also leading a second life that's outside of their reporting that's often, in my opinion, just as interesting. So, if I had just stopped there, I would have more free time. But I started to have other interests. I'm kind of an obsessive person who can disappear into internet rabbit holes for long periods of my life. And once you get this podcasting bug and you've already purchased the equipment and you've created a strange soundproof room in your basement, at that point, podcasting actually becomes one of the most direct ways to interact with whatever it is that's obsessing you. And the great thing about obsessive interests and the internet is whatever it is that interests you, there's probably someone online who is pretty interested in that. So the second show I started is called Stoner. So I don't know what is the marijuana legalization situation in Romania? Okay. Are there any cops in the audience here? I grew up in California. Marijuana is now legal in California, but I live in New York, and it's illegal in New York. And this is kind of an interesting, bizarre situation. I've always been interested in marijuana. And previously, it was kind of a taboo topic. I don't think that 5 or 10 years ago, I could have hosted a show on this topic because people would say, yeah, I don't really want my boss finding out that I went on a weed podcast. But this legalization really started opening people up. And what I found was that reporters and journalists were doing a great job of telling the political story and some of the business stories around entrepreneurship. But no one is really that interested in telling the human story, just about ordinary people and their interactions with marijuana, which, in my opinion, could have vast repercussions and changes for America. When you think about something like live music is basically just a way to sell beer. If everyone in America starts smoking weed instead of drinking beer, what else changes? These are the kinds of questions I asked on the show. I try to focus on creative people, artists, movie directors. That was something I just learned from doing the Longform podcast is people who make things are interesting, and they often haven't had a ton of forums to talk about the sort of secret side of what they do. So asking someone a question like, when was the first time you ever smoked weed? It becomes this wide open question where you're asking, where are you from? What were you like as a teenager? How did that person become the person you are now? So even though our main podcast, Longform, is ostensibly about journalism, I think about it more as the lives of journalists. And I think it's valuable to find unusual ways to get people to open up about their lives. So I started one more podcast. I got really into cryptocurrencies. My wife asked me to stop talking about them to her. And that is not a gendered comment. I mean, very specifically, my wife personally asked me to stop talking about them. And I also found that I was obsessively interested in it, and yet no matter how many hours I dedicated to reading about it online, I still felt like I didn't understand things. And podcasts can be a great way to cold email the smartest, most interesting people in the world and say, hey, would you like to have a 1-hour conversation with me? And if you can get like show art that has a Ferrari that's farting a flame, people actually respond. And you can get, like I was getting these people who were really like, you know, some of the most pioneering, brilliant people in this field. I also found ultimately that I was less interested in the technology than the scammers and charlatans that were attracted by it. And that becomes a fascinating story too, where I was able to talk to journalists who cover cryptocurrencies. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you want to pursue something, podcasting is a great excuse to pursue it. It's a great cover story to just ask someone point blank, can I come talk to you? I think you'd be surprised how many people have never been on a podcast and how eager people are to tell the story behind their work. If you're an academic cryptographer who's been doing this for the last 10 years in isolation, it's like this amazing experience to have someone ask, like, what do you do? How do you do it? And that's the kind of experience a listener might only get by being in a graduate program in the topic. So I appreciated in the introduction saying that Longform had become a resource for people who are interested in journalism. And I think that's a universal idea that if you conduct in-depth interviews and make them freely available to the public, you are creating a archive of knowledge that could in future generations be really important. Like, I think about some of the older people that we've had on long form podcasts. That may be the only like in-depth recording of them speaking that exists, and a lot of these people will not be around in a decade. So you don't really know where you're going when you start on a project like this. Okay, so I ended up hosting 3 podcasts at the same time. I don't recommend doing that. I hosted over 100 episodes in 2018. They were downloaded over 2 million times. I began to feel like a human podcast machine. So I'm going to give you all some unsolicited advice about what I learned in putting out 100 episodes in a year, and kind of like doing like my marathon training to be able to have the vigor to make it through 100 episodes in a year. Okay, this is more when you're getting going. So when I was starting in 2012, and I would guess this is still true if you go to your parents or people who are less fanatically online, they may say, I've never listened to a podcast, I don't know how it works. Very simple thing you can do here, which is just take their phone, go into the podcast app, if there's not one, download it, and subscribe to your podcast. You've just picked up a listener, and I've actually found a lot of people who I manually subscribe to my shows on their phone. That's the only shows that they've been listening for 5 years, and they've never even checked out a different podcast. So it's on you to teach people how it works. And when we first started the Longform podcast, I was under the impression that you could just put one mic on the table in between the 2 people, and it would just pick both people up. This is particularly embarrassing because I had actually been in bands and had some knowledge, and I don't know why I was like, we're only a few feet away. Do we really need to buy a second microphone? As a result, I would say the first 25 long-form podcast episodes are absolutely unlistenable. Max and I were trying to pull clips from them for this talk, and if we played them in here, the static would overwhelm the entire room. That said, I think that persistence is really key to being able to do it. Like, I didn't really feel comfortable podcasting until about episode 50, which means one episode every week for a year of being very bad at podcasting. And when I started Coin Talk, I actually forced my co-host, because he was new to podcasting. We, for 3 months, would tape a 1-hour show every week, not put it out, just straight into the trash. But by the time we launched the show, he was really comfortable. So in terms of designing for your audience, it can be pretty brutal to practice in public, but it can gain you something that I think is more important than the lost dignity, which is an audience. An audience is who you should be designing a podcast for. I think my biggest mistake early on was that I got hung up on the idea of what the show was, not who it was for. This in Silicon Valley, this would be called user experience design. And as it applies to podcasts, I think you could just boil it down to something like, how long should the intro to the show be? Should it be 30 seconds or 5 minutes? It's like, okay, well, put the earbud in your own here. 30 seconds, please. These kinds of decisions are a lot easier when you actually imagine a podcast listener on the other end. And for that reason, I would say to study shows that you really like. Longform podcast is just a direct clone of a show called WTF with Mark Maron. He was interviewing comedians at the time. We thought, what if we did that exact show with nonfiction writers? Um, So when we did start that show, a lot of people said, well, isn't journalism kind of going away? Isn't it kind of a dying industry? You're not exactly picking a lucrative niche here. And we now get over 100,000 listens per episode. And this is a bit hard to understand because it's true journalism is shrinking in America. You could probably even tell me that there aren't 100,000 full-time paid journalists in America. So clearly, people who are not journalists listen to the show. My first job in New York City was as an assistant to a cookbook editor. And she would always tell me that cookbooks are not for people who cook. They're for people who dream of cooking. They're an aspirational product. And I think there are a lot of people who dream of becoming writers. Maybe not even earning a living as a writer, but just writing a book, telling the story that they've always wanted to tell. And those are the people who you want to cultivate as an audience, the people who want to stand next to you. You can reach a lot more of them with a podcast than individually going out to coffee with everyone, which is what I used to do. You can efficiently disseminate that kind of knowledge. So I think this one gets ignored a lot. I've taped episodes in the morning that come out that afternoon. And over the more than 5 years we've been doing the Longform podcast, the whole media environment's actually changed. If this podcast was a book, it would probably still be about 2016. But there's a real flexibility and an ability to change what you're doing on the fly. So I think it's both good to do podcasts about things that are changing quickly and require up to the minute knowledge. And conversely, it's good to not be too, I don't know why I said conversely there. This is not the opposite. It's good to be open to changing what you're doing. I'm glad we're not doing a show where we make fun of articles every week. I don't think that would have lasted 5 years, but there's really no rules to podcasting. You can kind of make it whatever you want. So I would encourage people to start a podcast and then start another podcast or change the podcast you're doing. Okay. This is my number one note. A lot of people have told me they want to start a podcast, but they're waiting for the funding or the right equipment, or they're worried they'll do it and they won't get an audience. And my response, again, I said the first 50 episodes were bad. It's not hard to clone a podcast. Anyone can more or less make the same podcast as someone else. You could make all of the podcasts I've ever made with €100 worth of equipment and a spare bedroom at your house. What's hard is to do that every week without missing a week for over 350 weeks. That's a different kind of a skill, and I think you'll find that if you filter the podcast store by things that have existed, say more than 25 episodes, it gets very narrow. There's a lot of starting, which I'm in favor of, but there's not a lot of follow through. And what I've found is that the successful shows and the people who really got a lot out of podcasting are people who made a firm commitment. So when I started both of those shows, I decided no matter how many people listened to them, I would do them every week for a year. I failed on one of the accounts, but at the time I thought I would do that. And it really changes your whole disposition when you realize that you're going to be putting something out every week, even if it's bad. We put out really bad episodes before. I won't say who they are or what they are, but when you've done something hundreds of times, some of them are bad. And knowing that you're going to have to put it out, even if it's bad, is a great, great motivating force in what you're doing. Okay, this is the last one. The moment that oh no, second to last one. The moment that I realized that podcasting was different than anything I had ever done, um, I was in line at a coffee shop and someone recognized my voice. And I said, "Oh, hi." And they were like, "Oh, how's your back doing?" I was like, "What?" And I remembered that like 9 months earlier in an introduction, I had been talking about how I was having a lot of back pain. That is not an experience I've had in anything else I've done. I've been part of projects that are popular. I've had songs on pop charts before, and people will say, "Oh, I liked it," or "Good job," but people aren't interested in my life in that kind of a way. The feeling I got from this person was like we had a personal relationship, um, and in a way that makes sense. I mean, I think I did over 100 episodes in 2018, which means I posted 80 to 90 hours of me talking with another person. And if you listen to all 80 or 90 hours of it, which apparently some people have, um, that's more time than you've spent with your close friends probably over the course of a year. Like maybe only your spouse do you spend more than 80 or 90 hours with. Um, so it's an intimate relationship and it has different contours than, say, the relationship between a reporter and a reader. These are people who are like following my life over a period of years. And I think that just opens up new possibilities. And I guess what it's led me to think is that it's for the most part not about me, despite the fact that I've been talking myself in my podcasting. It's about the other people who come on the show and what I'm able to take from them. So my reason for being open and spending 80 to 90 hours of my life talking for a year is in some ways to encourage other people to be open. I once interviewed Tim Ferriss. People know he's kind of like a life hacker, new age guru kind of guy. And he'll do things like, embed with the world's greatest tightrope walker for 2 weeks and learn how to walk tightropes or how to skin animals in the wild. So he used to do these books where he would spend years with people and then turn the knowledge into a book. Now he does a podcast and he's like, you talk to them for about an hour and you get about the same amount as you do living with them for 2 weeks. Um, I think that suggests a certain density of human knowledge and human experience. And I think your challenge in podcasting, at least if you want to do a show that's along these lines, is to sort of extract that from other people, to take all of the incredible experiences that people are having out over the world and to coax them out. And, you know, in that sense, the more open you can be, the more you can ask that of other people. In the case of Stoner, I had to be really open about using marijuana, which is uncomfortable, but I couldn't possibly ask someone else to come on the show and do the same until I had done so. And I think it's been the same with Longform, not literally the same, but similarly open. And I haven't really talked very much about interviewing technique because I'm leaving that for my co host, Max Linsky. But it's been a rich experience. And since I've completely failed to tie this into heel because I didn't realize that I was supposed to until the very last second, I'll say that the experience that it's been the most like for me is therapy. I think like the reason talk therapy works is because we don't really know what we think until we express it. And for me, podcasting has been a forum both to have those kind of conversations myself, and ideally, in the case of long form podcast, bring out things in other people that they didn't know that they know. And I think journalists actually are, what they don't know is often very fascinating. And Max is going to talk a little bit about the techniques to get people to reveal that stuff. So thank you.